I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you. I'm Larry Mone, president of the Manhattan Institute. I want to thank you for joining us this morning for this important and timely discussion. On behalf of the Institute board and staff, I want to offer a special thanks to Governors Walker and Daniels for finding the time to be with us today. The Institute views controlling the soaring costs of public employment as one of the most important public policy issues of our time, and we are pleased to have organized this conference to further the national discussion. I'm also proud to note that the Institute has been way ahead of the curve on this issue. For several years, MI scholars such as Steve Malanga, E.J. McMahon, and Nicole Gelinas have been warning about the unsustainable rise in public employee pension and health care costs. Now that the situation has reached a crisis point, with cities and states teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, the Institute is doing all it can to offer practical ideas to help mayors and governors find a way out of the fiscal quagmire. Much of our research on these issues can be found at our new website, Public Sector Inc., which offers a wealth of ideas about how the social contract between taxpayers and public sector employees can be retooled in ways that make sense for the 21st century. The Institute sees its job as not only offering ideas to governors and mayors, but also helping them to make the case to the general public and the unions themselves that these programs are simply unsustainable and need to be restructured. There is a famous quote by Lincoln that I'm sure you're all familiar with, in which he says, "With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." That is why the Institute has also commissioned the renowned pollster Doug Schoen to take a detailed look at whether the American public fully understands how important it is to our fiscal future that we begin to rein in the cost of public employment. Doug will go through the results of his poll later this morning, but as he mentioned in his Wall Street Journal op-ed yesterday, while it is clear that taxpayers support reforming the terms of public sector employment in general, more work needs to be done to educate the public on the specific steps that are needed. I will now turn the podium over to Roger Hertog, who encouraged us to organize this conference and whose foundation has underwritten today's event. Roger is the former chairman of the Manhattan Institute, and his passion for ideas is well known to many of the people in the audience today. Roger not only talks about ideas, but uses his intellectual and financial capital to put them into action. Today, he serves as president of the Tikva Fund and chairman of the New York Historical Society. He has also served on the boards of the American Enterprise Institute, the New York Philharmonic, the New York Public Library, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In recognition of his philanthropic efforts, Roger has been awarded the Medal of the National Endowment of the Humanities and the William E. Simon Prize for Philanthropic Leadership. Please join me in welcoming Roger Hertog, who will introduce Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker.
Good morning. My role in this conference is to introduce Governor Scott Walker. I think the best way to go about this is to juxtapose his accomplishments against the purpose of the conference itself. It's called the New Contract, Reforming the Terms of Public Employment in America. The Manhattan Institute, as you all know, I was chairman for about a decade, has always been involved in major debates about the one reform or another. One of its biggest successes, if not its biggest success, came in the 90s when the Manhattan Institute developed the intellectual foundation for tackling the monstrous problems facing big cities like New York. Ultimately, Rudy Giuliani rescued New York City from passing over what to many feared to be total chaos. More than improve New York, Mayor Giuliani saved it. He did it to some extent, by putting into practice the Manhattan Institute's critical research on crime, policing, welfare, and tax reform. Ideas matter, but people matter a lot also, because you can't accomplish anything without people really coming together with important ideas. But as soon as one problem fades, another rears up. And certainly this has been the case for the past 20 years. This conference exemplifies the biggest dilemma now facing our cities, and even more important, our states: how to change in times of thin financial ground, when the revenue base has been significantly eroded, and there are big questions about when it will come back. The sad but true fact is, maybe it isn't so sad, but it's certainly true, is that cities and states can't print their own money. They have to balance their budgets in the face of a new reality: weak economic growth, lower tax receipts, and at the same time an explosion in entitlement costs, by which I mean the costs of providing pensions and health care insurance to their own employees. The challenge for every state is to manage their financial affairs so as to create a business-friendly environment that helps ensure not only that they prosper, but they also attract entrepreneurial talent to build the intellectual capital for the next generation, to be able to do the very things states have to do, which is to grow so they can take care of the disadvantaged, improve education, but you need growth to accomplish it. Please don't take my concerns about entitlement costs as an argument against public employees. Society couldn't function without them. But the contractual arrangements made by prior governments, both Republican and Democratic, with their employees have led to a disjunction between what a state can now afford and what it's required to fund. In this context, our speaker, Governor Scott Walker, has really been a true hero of our age. Only in office a few months, he stepped forward to decisively change relationships between his state and its employees that had always been viewed as sacrosanct. Perhaps even more remarkable, while he personally experienced a hailstorm, maybe even better put, a typhoon, of verbal abuse, Governor Walker has never been brash in return. He held his ground with remarkable civility. Today we'll hear from him and also from one of his comrade-in-arms, Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana. There are others out there. The real leadership is going on right now, I believe, at the state level. Unfortunately, many of them couldn't have been with us today. Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey, Susana Martinez in New Mexico, Nikki Haley in South Carolina, and Governor Andrew Cuomo here in New York, all contributing, each in his or her own way, to deal with the essential problem that states have. In a sense, what's going on is classically Madisonian, with the most important governments in the Republic being those in the states. It's also following the insight of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who said that states should function as the laboratories for democracy. Madison constructed the architecture, Brandeis defined it, and Governor Scott Walker is putting into practice what really hasn't been practiced for about 50 years. In time to come, I believe that as much as we look back at what Ronald Reagan did today and how he broke ground in the 80s, what Rudy Giuliani did for this city and others in the 90s, we'll look back at Scott Walker of Wisconsin and the other governors in our states as having created the model that really helped save the country. And with that, I'm privileged to introduce Governor Scott Walker.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Boy, after an introduction like that, getting in the same breath as Madison, Giuliani, and Reagan, I should just walk off the stage and say it was great to be with you here this morning. But Roger, thank you for that, for your comments, for your leadership, and for being here and helping us attract such a great crowd to talk about this morning. I appreciate it. It was interesting in the way, and I mentioned a couple folks, not the last time, but a couple times back. I was in town. I had the honor. Paul Ryan's one of my good friends. Grew up just down the way from me in Janesville. I grew up in a small town called Delavan, along the border. There must be something in the water, because Paul Ryan grew up in Janesville, about 15 minutes away. I grew up in Delavan. On the other side of us, about 15 minutes away, grew up Reince Priebus. So there's something about that section of Wisconsin. But I said I was in, per Paul's suggestion, being one of the guest hosts on Squawk Box and CNBC. And after we came back over to Manhattan, and I was going in for a meeting, I got out of the SUV we were in, and a guy yelled out, "Hey, Governor Walker." So instinctively I turned and I waved and I said, "Hi, good morning." He said, "You suck." He said, I followed you to Madison. I ran around the Capitol. I protested you. You're scum of the earth. And I said to the guy with me, I said, "See, they weren't from Wisconsin." So we had a little bit of fun with that. Of course, the next day, actually, I flew out of LaGuardia over to an event we had in Nashville to help with the cause with our Senate recalls. And as I got on the plane, I thought, nobody will know me. Well, a guy came up, third guy on the plane, came up and asked me to sign something and said, yeah, it was from New York, but he enjoyed what we were doing. So I said, for every action, there's a counteraction. In this case, it was somebody else who was a fan, not a foe. But I appreciate being with a group of folks who appreciate what we've done in Wisconsin and what people like Mitch Daniels did far before I took office, and many of us new governors took office, that really kind of set the table for the kind of reforms we're going to talk about today. The obvious question to begin with is, how's it working in Wisconsin? Well, if you met me on the street, my first reaction would be, well, the Brewers are 4 games away from clinching the playoffs. The Packers are in first place, and Wisconsin Badgers just moved up a couple places in the AP poll. But beyond that, the great news is, how's it going in Wisconsin, is it's working. It's working. I want to give you a couple examples and kind of set the table for how we got to where we're at and where we're headed in Wisconsin, and what kind of an impact that can have elsewhere across the country, both in states like Ohio, where they've taken that decisive first step but need to get over the next hurdle, as well as other states that need to take steps like what we did in Wisconsin earlier this year. It's interesting when we talk about it, though, talking about how it's working, probably the most classic example, and many of you here probably are well aware of this, others may have heard bits and pieces of it, but the reforms that we put in place earlier this year in Wisconsin weren't just about state government. Certainly they helped our state government. They saved us about $300 million. But in total, they saved our local governments about $1.44 billion worth of savings in terms of what the change in collective bargaining means. And the real impact on that are places like Kaukauna, a school district just down the way from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Kaukauna had about a $400,000 deficit before they took advantage fully of the reforms we provided to them. After they put those reforms into play, they went from a $400,000 deficit to a $1.5 million surplus. The great news with that is they used that money to hire more teachers, to lower classroom size, and what I like best of all long term isn't just one-time savings, is they're actually setting money aside, about $300,000 out of that surplus they're setting aside for merit pay. So they can actually pay for performance. They can reward the best and the brightest in their classroom. We see that all across the state of Wisconsin. It's interesting thinking about examples like that. It's not just our school districts, although those have been the most pronounced just because of the impact that collective bargaining reform has on our school districts because of our teachers union, but it happens in our cities, in our towns, in our villages, in our counties as well along the way. If you look at Milwaukee, obviously our largest city, kind of an interesting dynamic because the mayor of Milwaukee ran against me for mayor, or for a governor, I should say. The mayor talked back in March, as did other city leaders, about how when these reforms were out there, about how the reforms combined with the state budget was going to devastate the city of Milwaukee. It was all over the paper, talked about how awful and horrendous it was going to be, how devastating it was, my attack on the city of Milwaukee and other urban areas like that. A few months later, on the eve last month, the day before the recall elections for 6 Republican state senators, amazingly, the comptroller and treasurer in the city of Milwaukee found that the numbers didn't really add up the way they thought, and instead, the net savings for the city of Milwaukee, the net, not the overall savings, but the amount they net, even with the changes in the state budget formula, they net a minimum of at least 11, probably closer to $17 million in the next year alone. Now, it was interesting, the reporter who did the story on that, normally as a reporter doesn't care much for me, is always looking for some interesting way to back me into a corner, both when I was the county executive and now as the governor. But he went to the mayor of Milwaukee and he said, well, in March, I said, this is actually a pretty good journalistic question. He said, in March, you said that this was going to devastate the city of Milwaukee, and it was fall firmly on the lap of the governor, the blame for that. I said, now you're saying or your officials are saying that you're going to have a significant surplus. Doesn't the governor deserve some credit for that? The mayor's response was, well, that's a false question. But the reality is it's not. That's just avoiding the reality. But the reality of the situation is the reforms are working. And it works in a big city like Milwaukee. It works in small towns like the place where I grew up. It works all across the state of Wisconsin. In fact, I had the pleasure. I've got 2 sons who go to Wauwatosa East High School. It's a public school, the hometown where my home is today. And in fact, we split our time back and forth between the capital some days and other days back at our home in Wauwatosa. But my 2 sons, I've got a junior and a senior who go to Wauwatosa East High School. In that school district this summer, one of our school board members pointed out, for parents looking as to what was on the horizon, he said, the programs are going to be the same, the teachers are going to be the same. If anything, it's going to be more programs when you get to school. We saw that just a week ago. I was at the open house, walking through both Matt and Alex's schedule, saw one of his AP classes, and the teacher there talked about how in the past they had 3 courses in this section that were jammed full of almost 30 kids, and how this year there weren't as many. There were about 24, 25 in the class or less, and that there were a couple more sections. And being a father there, not as the governor, I bit my tongue and didn't ask why. But the reality is, at schools like that and others, the reforms and the savings from those reforms ultimately helped us do more, not less, with the schools that we have. Those are just a few of the multitude of examples of how it's working. Now, why did we have to do that? Well, in our case, much as Roger talked about, not only with states, but with cities and other local governments, we faced a budgetary crisis. We're facing an economic crisis, which I'll touch on in a second as well, but we faced a fiscal crisis. In our case, like more than 40 states in the District of Columbia, we had a budget crisis, a budget deficit going into the beginning of this year. In fact, 2 years ago, my predecessor in the legislature at that time passed one of the budgets with one of the largest structural deficits ever. We inherited in January a $3.6 billion deficit in a state of just over 5.5 million people. That's a $3.6 billion deficit for the biennium. And when we completed our budget repair bill and the budget we passed as fully enacted, we went from a $3.6 billion deficit to about a $300 million surplus. And the way we did it was it was a variety of things, but the simplest, most dynamic was we changed aid to local government. Our state, each jurisdiction is a little bit different, but the single largest portion of our budget in terms of general funds is aid we give to local governments, the vast majority of which is to our schools, but others go to our counties and our municipalities. In our case, we cut about $1.27 billion over the biennium out of our aid to local governments. A significant portion of that went to schools. But what we did that was different than almost any other jurisdiction across the country is we passed a budget reform bill before that budget that enabled and empowered both our state and our local governments to more than make up for those reductions in state aid with the savings we provided through our reforms. We gave tools to our state and to our local governments to be able to offset that. In the case of the state, it's about $300 million over the biennium. In the case of local governments all across our state, it's more than $1.1 billion worth of savings. So in total, 1.44 when you add the state and the local governments combined, we showed that there were greater savings than there were reductions in the state aid formula. That is incredibly important. Now, I came out for 8 years, I was the elected county executive in Milwaukee County. People ask, well, how many years has it been since a Republican was elected here? I said, well, it's not 20, it's not 40, it's not 60, it's never. There was never a Republican elected before there. In 2002, I came in after a pension scandal of all things. My predecessor had done a deal back more than a decade ago that gave these big lump sum pension backdrops without caps, had total rollover on unused sick leave time that got cash paid out at the end. All sorts of provisions like that, which unfortunately we see in too many jurisdictions across the country. We came in after that, after the public learned about that, started to fix that, correct that. All the pundits said, well, after you get elected, because it was a scandal, you never get reelected, because they've never elected a Republican before. When we got elected twice, more after that. First election was 54%, next election was 57%, the final election in 2008, when I was reelected, was nearly 60% of the vote. My belief is, if you tell people the truth in times of crisis, what they want more than anything is not Republican leadership, it's not Democrat leadership, they just want leadership. And so we acted on that. We pointed it out. But I had, for a period, Roger, kind of like what you were talking about with Mayor Giuliani kind of laying the table here, or setting the table, I should say, laying the framework. We did what we called a reality tour. Now, one of my newspapers dubbed it the doom and gloom tour, but we called it the reality tour. And the reality was we talked about how pension and health care costs were growing at such a pace, we weren't going to be able to rein that in. And in turn, we made the case for why we did make some structural changes. Now, we did that at the county, and over time, having been a county executive, I dealt with AFSCME and the other public employees union. So when I got in the midst of this, when people would talk about, why are you doing this, what's going on, you talked about the demeanor we had. I said every day, every press conference I had, I laid out that there were more than 300,000 public servants in my state, at both the state and the local level. And I had great respect and admiration for them. My kids go to public school. I use public services. I love the people who are public servants in our communities all across the state of Wisconsin. My fight wasn't with them. But I also knew that not only for them, but for the people who depend on the services they provide, we had a situation that was unsustainable. We couldn't sustain it. And so one of the great things about how it's working is the reality that unlike other states across the country, even my neighbor to the south, which a week ago Governor Quinn laid off thousands of public employees, even after earlier this year having a massive, and I mean a massive tax increase, about 2/3 of an increase on individual income taxes, almost 50% on business taxes, and they still have an $8 billion budget deficit. They laid off thousands of public employees. They shut down 7 state facilities. We didn't have to go through any of those things because we balanced our budget by reining in our legacy costs, by getting our benefit costs and our health care cost premiums under control and empowering our local governments, which is the biggest part of our general fund budget, to do the same with their jurisdiction. So along the way, some people said, well, okay, that's great. It was about the budget. You're broke, other people are broke, other jurisdictions are broke. But why did you have to completely repeal collective bargaining? Fair question. In fact, I remember in the thick of this, I was on Meet the Press one Sunday morning, and David Gregory kept saying, well, 2 of your statewide union leaders have said that they'll concede the 5% and the 12% for the pension and health care contribution if you would just back off of the collective bargaining changes. And I pointed out to Mr. Gregory, having been an elected official for 8 years at the local level, that just doesn't happen. In our state, the statewide leader of the teachers union of AFSCME cannot make a contract for all of our local governments. There are more than 1,700 municipalities. There are 72 counties. There are 424 school districts. Each of those negotiate their contract with their collective bargaining unit individually. And in fact, the proof was in the pudding. At that time, from the day I introduced the budget repair bill until the day it was passed, there was a mass rush in many jurisdictions of the unions to go out and settle contracts before the law went into effect. You know how many of them settled for 5% and 12%? 0. Not a one of them. I said if their argument was a valid argument, they would be settling, making that 5.8% contribution for the pension match and making the 12.6% for health care premiums. But none of them did that. They all settled for something less than. In some cases, some of them ran out to do contracts that had no new pension or health care contribution. To me, that really proved, the rhetoric didn't match the reality of the situation. And I had seen that for years as an elected county executive. Time and time again, when I would try to avoid massive layoffs, when we were faced with budget crises at our county level, I would go to the unions and say, well, let's just make a slight change in our pension contribution or a slight change in the health care premium. One year, I even tried to do, for 4 months, 1 week a month, to do a 35-hour work week to avoid layoffs. And every time the union said to me, forget it. Lay 400 or 500 people off. We don't care. You'll be gone in a few years, and we'll bring those people back, and we won't have our benefits adjusted. That was the mindset out there. That's really what we did. In fact, if anything, and why a forum like this is so important, if anything, I look back in time, I mentioned this, I don't know, a couple months back, and Mika asked me about this on Morning Joe here in town. He said, what would you do differently? I said that the one strategic mistake I think I made in all this was I came into this with the mindset of a chief executive officer, of someone who's running a business, and said, here's a problem, here's a solution, and then we went out and fixed it. We had no idea the kind of attention that we get. We knew there'd be pushback, because I got pushback at the county, but we had no idea the kind of national attention that this would get. And in fact, in the first couple of weeks after I introduced the budget repair bill, literally the national unions poured $4 to $5 million worth of money just into ads attacking me and the budget repair bill. Not any candidate, not about the Supreme Court race or the Senate recalls or anything else, just based on the bill and me. If we had thought about that, we would have laid the table earlier. We would have set up a marketing campaign. We would have got all the kind of information you're going to talk about today out early. But silly me, I thought you get elected, you talk about what you're going to do, and then you go out and do it. You don't have to keep running a campaign over and over again. That's probably the best message to pass on to other governors and mayors and others out there, is be prepared, because the defenders of the status quo are going to do everything in their power. And they're not just talking about having an intellectual debate at a podium, at a forum like this, or on the floor of the State Assembly or the State Senate. They're talking about bringing out all the stocks. They're probably about putting TV ads up and bringing people in and bringing people from across the country. And that's exactly what we saw. And that had an impact, because early on we were focused on just balancing the budget and getting things done. So that had a tremendous impact out there. A couple other quick things, and then I'll wrap it up and take some questions here. You talked about the 5 and the 12, as I mentioned. That wasn't going to happen without a change. Once the bill was passed and while it was pending in the courts, you did at that point then see a number of jurisdictions that did go out and settled for the 5 and the 12%. Why? Because the other changes we made, in addition to the pension health care contribution, we had the audacity to say that the workers, who we really cared about, the public employees in our state, should actually have the option of determining whether or not they were in a public employee union. So they were given the right to choose whether or not they wanted to be in a union. And they ultimately, their unions had to prove that they were worth each year being up for a vote to designate them as a union for their certification. That's really ultimately why a lot of these jurisdictions ran out and settled for the 5 and 12, so they could lock in the fact that they could still collect those dues. Because really, when it came right down to it, the officials we heard from were more interested in keeping those dues monies than anything else out there. And so that's why there was the rush along the way. But we saw the other big element that was out there was, besides the pension and health care contribution, by changing collective bargaining, by essentially narrowing it down just to the base salary, and nothing else was a part of collective bargaining, school districts and jurisdictions could make changes in other areas. A good example, under who provided your health insurance coverage, for years many of our schools had something called WEA Trust. That was the Teachers Union Health Insurance Company. And so under contract, they'd mandate that had to come through the contract to WEA Trust. Well, once we changed it, it opened up for competition. We saw tremendous savings. Just a couple examples. Heartland Arrowhead School District, one of the schools my kids play in football, saved $690,000. Marshfield School District in northern Wisconsin saved $850,000. Kimberly saved $821,000. Germantown saved $1 million. Appleton, a district just down the way from Green Bay, Wisconsin, saved $3.1 million, not by taking benefits away, but by just purely opening the market up to competition instead of designating that it just had to go to the WEA Trust. That was real money that could go into the classroom instead of into the hands of the teachers union or its subsidiary, the provider of the health insurance premiums out there. And we saw it in terms of changing rules as well. I knew that as a local elected official, that things like overtime provisions and others would have a tremendous savings if you could change that under the collective bargaining rules. In one of our jurisdictions alone, Manitowoc, a relatively small community, saved about $100,000 just by changing overtime. We saw prior to that, I saw my own experience, but I saw all across the state work rules that had an impact on the budget, but equally as important in service delivery out there. Things like the Green Bay School District had an emeritus program where you'd get a year's worth of salary just for working up to 30 days over a 3-year period. You could collect a year's worth of salary upon retirement. The Madison School District was even more outrageous. Without working a day, if you signed up for it as a emeritus program, you could earn almost $10,000 just by signing up as part of the employee contract out there. You had correctional officers and employees who were paid $6,000 a year just for carrying a pager, or places where, because of overtime, we had bus drivers in the city of Madison who made $150,000 or more per year. Those were all things that were provisions because of collective bargaining. Now, the final part is, you hear a lot of people say, well, collective bargaining is a right. We saw that in the ads all the time. Collective bargaining is not a right. It is an expensive entitlement. If it was a right, and I pointed out when the President of the United States took a shot at me back early in the spring, and I have all due respect to the office, so I didn't get too personal, but I said this very bluntly. When he went out, I remember Governor Christie called me up. He was at the White House. I was still back in Madison because I was trying to get those 14 senators to come back, so I figured I couldn't be out of the state at a conference at the White House. But the President took a shot at me, and I said that afternoon when I had my press conference, with all due respect to the President, I believe that he must know that federal employees do not have collective bargaining for wages and benefits. I know he must just know that. And I know the President of the United States must know that the average federal employee pays 28% for their health insurance premium, which is double what I'm asking for state and local employees in the state of Wisconsin. Because I know the President of the United States would not take his talking points from the AFL-CIO or AFSCME or any other public employees union. He would be making those decisions on his own because he's the President of the United States. I know he must know that. And that's what was at odds. We're trying to fight that. It's why, for us, it's been interesting. I know you're going to talk about some poll numbers later. We didn't do this because of polling. We do it because it's the right thing out there. But I know over time, reality, the results matter. We saw that with Mitch Daniels, who took this issue on a statewide basis, not just at the local level. Went from very low in the polls to ultimately being reelected with 58% of the vote. In our case, I know results matter. But you see, we started out with that $4 to $5 million against us. We saw millions of dollars spent in our Supreme Court race to try and beat us there. We saw literally tens of millions of dollars against those 6 Republican senators. In fact, if you add all 12 candidates combined, the 6 incumbents and the 6 challengers, the union spent more money than all 12 of them combined fighting us on this very issue. And yet, every step of the way, results mattered, and the voters sided with us in the debate, because despite the attacks, despite the misinformation and disinformation and everything else out there, results matter. And I believe we haven't run one ad yet today about our successes. We will in the future. In the coming days, we'll be talking about that, depending on what happens with a recall against me or others in the state legislature. And I believe the more we get the information out about how it's working in our schools and our local governments, and how this December, when people get their property tax bills and see that they're actually frozen because of our reforms as well, I believe the voters will respond accordingly in the future election. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to share this message. It's been working with our job creators. Back earlier this spring, Chief Executive Magazine does a survey every year of about 500 CEOs from across America. For years, we didn't talk much about it in Wisconsin because we were ranked somewhere between 40 and 50. This year, we went from 41 last year up to 24, 17 spots, the fastest increase of any state in the country, the fastest increase of any state in the history of that survey. When I talked to the publisher, one of the things they mentioned in the verbatims was that employers said what was happening in Wisconsin this spring actually was an inspiration to them, because they realized we were tackling the structural challenges. That means in the future, we will have stable governments not only at the state level but at the local level. That means this is a good place for people to invest in the state of Wisconsin. That ultimately means more jobs for our people and our constituents, and I think that's good for the future as well. So maybe with that, I'll open it up and take some questions if people have them.
All right, folks, we only have a few minutes for questions, so please make sure you identify yourself and your affiliation and ask a question versus make a statement. Roger, would you like to start?
Governor, what are the rules and how much money would it take to do a recall on you?
Yeah, the bizarre thing in Wisconsin, and when I talk to governors, Democrat and Republican alike, they all shake their head and wonder how we got this law, but it is the law. To recall any elected official in state government, it takes 25% of the vote in that jurisdiction, so in my case statewide, from the last gubernatorial election. So that's a little bit over about 500,000, almost 600,000 votes would be representative of 25% of our last gubernatorial election. They would need to collect almost 600,000 signatures within a 60-day period. The soonest they can do that, you can't be recalled until you've served at least a year in office. So in my case, that's January 3rd. They could start circulating the first week in November. And if they were successful, technically have a vote as early as January. Realistically, based upon what the Government Accountability Board, which runs elections, did for these senators, it would probably be late spring, early summer if they had one. What's equally or probably more likely is that they'll attempt to go after a number of state lawmakers, both in the Senate and the Assembly, who are in relatively vulnerable districts from the past, and probably at the same time they're attempting to go after me, would go after them as well. But that's the timing and that's the rules on it. There's no cause. You know, unlike recalls in other states where it has to be for misconduct in office or anything else like that, there is no cause out there. They can do it for just about anything. How much money would I have to raise? Great question. In our case, I spent $13 million in Wisconsin last November, or the 18 months leading up to that, which was the all-time record. About 80% of that was people who gave me $50 or less, so it's a good grassroots effort as well. But to put that in perspective, the total amount spent on those recall elections for just state Senate districts was about $40 million. And Republicans were outspent about 2 to 1. So who knows how much we'd have to spend, but and I say they in the sense of not just locally, but my guess would be if there's a recall effort that's successful in getting on the ballot, it's not successful in defeating me, but successful in getting on the ballot, that means they probably had national money coming in from the unions. As you can guess, I've got a pretty good target in my head nationally, but probably, I would guess would probably be at least $30 to $40 million.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Sir?
Tom McCardle with Investors.
Behind you.
Thanks. Tom McCardle with Investors Business Daily.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Governor, for being here. On the specifics of your budget reforms, can you claim total originality for the things you've done, or did you look at some of the things done in other states over the past, or did you rely a lot on the work of think tanks like the Manhattan Institute?
Well, we did a number of things. One, clearly you're going to hear from Mitch Daniels later today. Mitch, without a doubt, for me, and I think a lot of the new governors, is an inspiration. Now, I would have preferred to find somewhere in my drawer something that gave me an executive order like Mitch did in Indiana more than 6 years ago, as opposed to passing a specific piece of legislation. Mitch did it for state employees. He did it because Evan Bayh created collective bargaining in that state under an executive order, so he could sign an executive order repealing that. He did it right away after taking office. It had a tremendously positive impact, not only for the taxpayers, but ultimately for great public employees in the state government who are now rewarded and can be identified and given performance compensation as well. We looked at that and said we wanted to do that, but then we looked beyond that at our budget crisis and said, well, why just do it for state government? If the biggest single portion of our state budget when it comes to our general fund is money we give to local governments, we knew we'd have to rein that in. We knew we'd have to do what nearly every other state did across America, and that is cut our budget and in turn cut aid to schools and local governments. What I thought looking at that, though, really kind of out of this budget crisis was, why not do that at the same time you're giving your local governments the ability to make changes in their pension and the health care contribution and overall in their work rules that would provide them kind of savings to offset that. I thought it was a perfect storm to be able to make those sorts of long-term structural changes. Certainly ideas that I've heard from all sorts of different groups out there were a part of it, but really ultimately for me it was two things. It was my 8 years as a county executive where I saw firsthand the frustration of unions not being willing to give any concessions in order to save jobs. And secondly, my looking at this budget crisis, knowing that we'd have to make cuts, and not wanting to have that have a negative impact on the services I provided to my constituents, nor in a time when I had a huge, not only budgetary crisis, but an economic crisis, as everybody else does across America, or nearly everybody else. I didn't want to do what other states are doing and lay off thousands of public employees. To me, I didn't, as I said repeatedly during these press conferences, I don't want any layoffs. I don't want layoffs of public employees nor private sector employees. I need to find more ways to put people to work, not more ways to see people laid off. And so we found that this was a viable alternative to doing what other states were doing with just cuts that ultimately led either to massive layoffs or massive tax increases, neither of which was acceptable to me.
All right, we have time for one last question, and then the governor has to go. Sir?
Good morning. Mike Fitzpatrick, a member of the State Assembly from Suffolk County. Governor, elected officials here in New York State, and I'm sure across the entire country, enjoy the benefit of a defined benefit pension. Yeah. Do you believe that the culture created by a defined benefit pension among elected officials creates the incentive to take that path of least resistance? If you lose an election, you're no longer in the pension system, and therefore there's an incentive to avoid fiscal reality and hard decisions.
Yeah, I think, well, twofold. Without a doubt, I think that plays a role, particularly the longer people have been there. My general premise was, I was in the Assembly, I was the county executive, obviously now governor. My view is 8 to 10 years, it's time to move on because you get complacent, you start taking advantage of things like that. Obviously, there are exceptions to any rule out there, but I think that plays a part of it. The other part, though, is I think there's a vicious cycle beyond that. I mean, in the sense that you think you take taxpayers' money to pay public employees, but under the old system, a portion of that payment not only went to the employees, it went in part to the unions. You know, the unions then used it to advocate for candidates who wanted more benefits and more, components out there. They elected candidates who did that. I mean, it was just this vicious cycle out there. This breaks that cycle and puts the power back in the hands of the people, of the taxpayers, and ultimately it rewards great employees. One of the great things I got early on in this, I'd go out and I'd be at events, and obviously wasn't a majority, but I'd get people, I could always tell when a teacher was going to come up to talk to me who was favorable, because he or she would look around either way first, and then they'd whisper, "You're doing a good job, keep it up." And almost every time when I talked to him, I'd find out that either he or she was married to someone in the private sector. So they could relate, they could understand. Now, the interesting thing is in the last month or so, it's gone a step beyond just people recognizing the fiscal benefit. I've had teachers who come up to me who've said, I went back a week or two early to get ready, and what I really love is the fact that the school is filled with great teachers. You see, a year ago, the interesting story here, a year ago, a young woman in the Milwaukee Public School District, which needs tremendous help in the future, but was named the Outstanding Teacher of the Year for the entire state. A week later, she got a pink slip. That's because my predecessor in the previous legislature cut hundreds of millions of dollars from public education, but didn't give the schools any tools, so they were forced to lay off hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, statewide of teachers out there. Well, she was last in, so she was first out under her union contract. Collective bargaining said seniority trumps everything. What we did here is not only change the fiscal climate, what we did gets rid of all those rules. So now every school and local government can hire and fire based on merit. They can pay based on performance. We can keep and put the best and the brightest in our classrooms and in our cities and counties and in our state government. That is a tremendous benefit. I know that goes far beyond your question, but I think that's another untold story, is that we didn't just make a pension and a health care contribution. We transformed the way we provide services. And the last thing I'll just take the liberty to say here for a second, and I know I've got to run off and do John Stossel, so my apologies for running off. But Saturday, this last Saturday, we celebrated, what was it, the 220, do my math here quick, 224th anniversary of the Constitution up in Philadelphia. And you think about it. I was just there last week with a meeting with some governors, with Kasich and Corbett and others out there, and I stopped. Tonette and I love to stop at historical sites, so we went over to the Constitutional Hall. We saw the Liberty Bell, but standing in that room, where they approved the Constitution, and you think back to that, and a few years before that, the Declaration of Independence. You think about what's made this country great. What's made this country great is for more than 200 years in times of crisis, we've had men and women of courage who stood up and led, who thought more about their children and their grandchildren's future than they did about their own political futures. That's what's at stake here, not just in Wisconsin, but in Indiana and New York and Texas and in the halls of Congress more than ever. We need people who have the courage to stand up and do what's right and think about the next generation more than we think about the next election. And this issue isn't as sexy as maybe some other issues out there, but in the end, this issue will trump everything else. We talk about education and higher ed and health care and long-term care. If you don't tackle the out-of-control legacy costs in state and local governments, there isn't going to be any money to tackle all those other important issues. So when we take these issues on, it may not be as exciting, but in the end, when I think about my sons, Matt and Alex, who are 17 and 16, I realize in the end, what we're doing, what we're championing, what we took action on, will ensure that they inherit not only a government, but a society that's better able to tackle those challenges in the future than one we inherited today. So thank you very much for being interested in it. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Governor. Please. Let's hear it for Governor Scott Walker.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.